American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933–1945. American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933–1945. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30, 1882 at his parents' estate in Hyde Park, New York. His father, James, was a country gentleman who made money in railroads and coal. His mother, Sarah, was a strong-willed woman who adored her only child and remained a central figure in his life until her death in 1941. Roosevelt trained as a lawyer in Harvard University, and in 1910 he joined active politics. He was elected to the New York Senate on the Democratic Party ticket. He became the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy during the time of Woodrow Wilson. In 1920 he contested as a vice president but failed, and in 1928 he was elected governor of New York. As governor he helped people who were unemployed during the Great Economic Depression, which began in 1929. In 1932 he was elected the 32nd President of USA, and in his inaugural speech on 4th March 1933 he restored hope among the people of America when he said that, "First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He was a man who kept his promises. He introduced a policy known as New Deal policy that restored hope to the Americans and turned around the economy within 100 days, which up to date are known as 100 flower days. The New Deal policy, domestic policy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. New Deal policy was the domestic program of the administration of U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt between 1933 and 1939, which took action to bring about immediate economic relief as well as reforms in industry, agriculture, finance, water power, labor, and housing, vastly increasing the scope of the federal government's activities. The term was taken from Roosevelt's speech accepting the Democratic nomination for the presidency on July 2, 1932. Reacting to the ineffectiveness of the administration of President Herbert Hoover in meeting the ravages of the Great Depression, American voters the following November overwhelmingly voted in favor of the Democratic promise of a New Deal for the forgotten man, opposed to the traditional American political philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism. The New Deal generally embraced the concept of a government-regulated economy aimed at achieving a balance between conflicting economic interests. The New Deal policy involved the government controlling some aspects of the U.S. economy, including businesses. It was a traditional American policy to leave businesses to be privately owned and run, but in the New Deal policy, government was to intervene in some sectors in order to make the economy function. The New Deal policy aimed at achieving some goals: to provide relief by directing help to millions of Americans who had no food at their homes, to reform policies in order to avoid repetition of the past mistakes, and indeed this policy was successful that after 3 months the New Deal came to be known as 104 days. American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933–1945. The New Deal policy was the domestic policy of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which he announced in January 1933 while making his inaugural speech as American president. It contained a series of reforms that were carefully designed to mitigate the Great Economic Depression that the American economy was engulfed in since 1929. The Great Depression had made Americans lose hope in their economy, and it was against this background that the new president came up with reforms that were to restore hope. The New Deal policy, which almost contradicted with capitalism, had the following elements/components. In May, he signed the Tennessee Valley Authority Act into law, creating the Tennessee Valley Authority TVA and enabling the federal government to build dams along the Tennessee River that controlled flooding and generated inexpensive hydroelectric power for the people in the region. That same month, Congress passed a bill that paid commodity farmers who produced things like wheat, dairy products, tobacco, and corn to leave their fields fallow in order to end agricultural surpluses and boost prices. June's National Industrial Recovery Act guaranteed that workers would have the right to unionize and bargain collectively for higher wages and better working conditions. It also suspended some antitrust laws and established a federally funded Public Works Administration. In April 1935, he created the Works Progress Administration (WPA) to provide jobs for unemployed people. WPA projects weren't allowed to compete with private industry, so they focused on building things like post offices, bridges, schools, highways, and parks. The WPA also gave work to artists, writers, theatre directors, and musicians. In July 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, created the National Labor Relations Board to supervise union elections and prevent businesses from treating their workers unfairly. In August, FDR signed the Social Security Act of 1935, which guaranteed pensions to millions of Americans, set up a system of unemployment insurance, and stipulated that the federal government would help care for dependent children and the disabled. Emergency Banking Act. March 9, FDR closed all banks as soon as he was inaugurated to stop bank runs. It was enacted at great speed. A special session of Congress passed the bill in 7.5 hours. This act allowed banks to reopen once examiners found them to be financially secure. 5,000 banks reopened in the next 3 days. Government Economy Act March 20. The act cut the pay of government and military employees by 15%. It cut government spending by 25%. The $1 billion saved went to finance New Deal programs. Beer Wine Revenue Act March 22. It legalized the sale of beer and wine. And American history Franklin Delano Roosevelt 1933–1945. Civilian Conservation Corps April 5. The program hired 3 million workers over the next 10 years to conserve public land. They planted forests, built flood barriers, and maintained roads and trails. Abandonment of gold standard April 20. FDR stopped a run on precious metal. He ordered everyone to exchange all gold for dollars. Federal Emergency Relief Act May 12. This program funded a wide variety of jobs in agriculture, the arts, construction, and education. Agricultural Adjustment Act May 12. This legislation subsidized farmers to reduce crops. It doubled crop prices by 1937. It was overturned by Supreme Court in 1936 because it taxed processors but gave funds to farmers. That was remedied in 1938. Emergency Farm Mortgage Act May 12. The act provided loans to save farms from foreclosure. Tennessee Valley Authority Act May 18. A program established a federal corporation that built power stations in the Tennessee Valley, the poorest area in the nation. Securities Act May 27. It required corporations to provide information to investors before issuing stock. Abrogation of Gold Payment Clause June 5. The government no longer had to repay dollars with gold. Homeowners Refinancing Act June 13. The act established the Homeowners Loan Corporation that refinanced mortgages to prevent foreclosures. It also provided additional capital to mortgage lenders. When it closed in 1935, it had refinanced 1 million homes, which was the equivalent of 20% of all urban mortgages. Glass-Steagall Banking Act June 16. This law separated investment banking from retail banking. It prevented retail banks from using depositors' funds for risky investments. It gave the regulation of retail banks to the Federal Reserve, prohibited bank sales of securities, and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The act was repealed in 1999 by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. National Industrial Recovery Act June 16. This labor and consumer law set up the Public Works Administration to create public works jobs, like San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge and New York City's Triborough Bridge. This law also created the National Recovery Administration. It outlawed child labor, established a minimum wage of $1.25, and limited the workday to 8 hours. It gave trade unions the legal right to bargain with employers. It was declared unconstitutional in 1935. Emergency Railroad Transportation Act June 16. This piece of legislation attempted to coordinate the national railway systems. American history Franklin Delano Roosevelt 1933–1945. Civil Works Administration of 9 created thousands of construction jobs to put people to work. Congress ended it on March 31, 1934. Gold Reserve Act January 30. FDR prohibited private gold ownership. He increased the price of gold to $35 per ounce, up from $20.67 per ounce where it had been for 100 years. That almost doubled the value of the gold held in Fort Knox from $4.33 billion to $7.348 billion, making the United States the world's largest owner of gold. National Housing Act June 27. This law established the Federal Housing Administration, which provides federal insurance for mortgages. Securities Exchange Act. The law created the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates stocks and the stock market. Federal Communications Act. The act consolidated all federal regulation of telephone, telegraph, and radio communications under the Federal Communications Commission. The government came up with the Brain Trust program. This was a body of scholars and academicians who were given the duty to analyze and discuss the problems affecting the country and to propose solutions to the government. The government came up with relief packages in order to restore confidence in both consumers and producers. The government made sure that banks and other financial institutions started functioning again. This was intended to restore confidence in the banking sector. Roosevelt's administration came up with the Civilian Conservation Corps program. This was to provide jobs to the unemployed youth, and they were to work in conservation projects like reforestation, fighting forest fire outbreaks, and prevention of floods, among others. This went a long way to reducing the problem of unemployment in the country. The government came up with a program to improve on the conditions of workers, for instance, allowing them to form national labor relations squads to settle affairs of workers. American history Franklin Delano Roosevelt 1933–1945. He came up with the Farmers Relief Program, and under this program, the government helped farmers to improve on their income, which had dropped, by fixing prices of agricultural products. and by 1937 success had been achieved because the farmers' incomes doubled. Roosevelt's foreign policy. In the period between 1933 and 1939, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was more concerned domestic policies in order to put the economy to order once again. This was necessary in order to promote the economic interests of the Americans, like welfare. His second major task was to change the American foreign policy from isolationism to active involvement in world affairs. This was necessary in order to promote Americans' interests in the world, getting external markets among others. However, his major problem was the Congress and the Americans, who were still conservative about isolationism, but Roosevelt used tactics to make them change along with him, and between 1936 and 1939 he made America to play the role of neutral country. In 1939 he introduced the Lend-Lease program to enable America to give moral and material support to other countries that were on the side of the Allied powers, and by 1945 he had made America to actively participate in world affairs, and this affected the whole world. Reasons why America abandoned the policy of isolationism. Since 1941, isolationism was a traditional American policy in foreign affairs which involved the American government strictly playing a dominant role in world affairs. This policy can be traced from 1920, when the American government deliberately opted to concentrate on internal matters affecting their economy. For instance, she kept out of the League of Nations and did not participate in international conflicts of the 1930s. However, during the Roosevelt administration, new demands emerged which necessitated revising the policy of isolationism. Roosevelt started by making America play a neutral role in the mid-1930s, but in 1939 he introduced the Lend-Lease program to provide moral and material assistance to Allied powers, while in 1941 he made America to officially join the Second World War on the side of Allied powers. Since then, all the successive American presidents have maintained the same policy of active involvement in world politics. A number of factors have been advanced to explain the American abandonment of isolationism. 1. The change in leadership from conservative leaders was the beginning of shift from isolationism. America changed from conservative leaders like Herbert Hoover to progressive and foresighted leaders like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Ronald Reagan, among others, who realized American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933–1945. 3. The Japanese attack on the Pearl Harbor in 1941 made USA to abandon the policy of isolationism. Pearl Harbor was an American possession military base located on Hawaii Island, and it was attacked by the Japanese on 7 December 1941. This was indeed a direct attack on the USA. Therefore, the Roosevelt administration, in an attempt to defend America, declared war against Japan and other Axis powers on 8 December 1941, thus abandoning the policy of isolationism. 4. The desire to protect the free world made USA to abandon the isolation policy. From the mid-1930s, some aggressive powers had taken it upon themselves to aggress all states. For example, in 1931 and 1937, Japan attacked China. In 135, Italy attacked Ethiopia, while Germany attacked Czechoslovakia in 1938 and Poland in 1939. These very aggressive powers constituted themselves into the Axis powers that jeopardized peace of the free world from September 1939 in what came to be known as World War II. The American government under President Franklin Roosevelt became concerned about defending the innocent countries and restore order in the world. Roosevelt therefore declared war against Axis powers, hence abandoning the policy of isolationism. 5. America acquired a new spirit of imperialism which made her abandon the policy of isolationism. Whereas America never participated in the 19th century scramble for colonies, she later became interested in acquiring spheres of influence in Asia, Africa, and Europe to directly or indirectly control, so that she could be able to exploit them by selling her surplus product. Besides, after the Second World War, USA was a major contestant in the Cold War politics, and therefore she wanted satellite states. 6. The need to implement the spirit of the Atlantic Charter forced the US government to abandon isolationism. The Atlantic Charter was issued in 1941 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Britain. The Charter recommended the granting self-determination and freedom to all people in the world. The USA therefore wanted to supervise and ensure that freedom continued to prevail as intended by the Atlantic Charter. Colonial masters like Spain, Britain, and France had to respect the Charter. Therefore, to enforce the implementation of the Charter, USA abandoned the policy of isolationism. 7. The US position as the new commander of the Second World War made her to abandon the isolation policy. When the USA joined the Second World War in 1941, the American General Dwight Eisenhower was assigned the American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933–1945. Even was used for the right cause, and those who got it had to come up with democratic governments, and while those with colonies had to grant independent Therefore, in order to meet the targets of MAP, proper supervision was necessary, and hence the abandonment of isolationism became inevitable. 9. The launching of Truman Doctrine or containment policy made the USA to abandon her policy of isolationism. This policy was announced by President Harry Truman in 1947 at the height of the Cold War tension. It called for the American government engaging in activities meant to prevent further spread of communism in the world. In order to implement this containment policy, the US government found itself engaging in anti-communist activities around the world. E.g., from 1948, the Truman administration extended financial assistance to the governments of Turkey and Greece against communist rebels, among other activities, hence abandonment of the policy of isolationism. 10. The US commitment under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO also led her to abandon the isolation policy. In April 1949, USA committed herself to the North Atlantic Treaty alongside Canada and Western European countries. NATO is a collective defense mechanism for capitalist powers, and thus USA had to defend her allies, which forced her to abandon the policy of isolationism. 11. The initiation of Mutual Assistance Act in May of 1951 made America to abandon isolation policy. Under this act, USA extended financial, security and export aid to friendly countries, and this put her directly into involvement of world affairs. 12. The US commitment to the United Nations Organization (UNO) made her abandon the policy of isolationism. The US government was involved in all processes that led to the emergence of the UNO in 1945. For instance, she hosted the San Francisco Conference in California, at which the UNO Charter was declared. The USA went ahead to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council and also accommodated the headquarters of the UNO in New York. Such a role USA played in the UNO, which also extended to the maintenance of world peace and security, for her to abandon the policy of isolationism. Summary of Roosevelt's foreign policies. Roosevelt also introduced the Land-Lease policy, under which USA extended aid in form of material, moral and financial to Allied powers fighting against Axis powers. After Germany declared war on the Soviet Union in 1941, Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union as well. American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933–1945. The key foreign policy initiative of Roosevelt's first term was the Good Neighborhood policy, in which the U.S. took a non-interventionist stance in Latin American affairs. Roosevelt introduces the Good Neighborhood policy, under which close ties were established between USA and countries of Latin America. They were cooperated especially in cultural and economic matters, and this made America to drop isolation policy. After Japan invaded China and Germany invaded Poland, Roosevelt provided aid to China, Britain and to France, but public opinion opposed the use of the American military. After the fall of France in June 1940, Roosevelt increased aid to the British and began a very rapid build-up of air power. In response to the July 1941 Japanese occupation of southern French Indochina, Roosevelt expanded a trade embargo on Japan. After attempting to reopen oil exports, Japan launched an attack on the U.S. fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt came up with War Policy 1941. This led America into the Second World War following the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. America did not only provide command military personnel, but also provided several resources in fighting the Axis powers until the war ended in 1945. Roosevelt also came up with a policy that led to the birth of the United Nations Organization (UNO). Right Form 1941. A series of conferences were organized to see how best the League of Nations was to be replaced by a more viable organization which would bring about lasting peace and security. One of such conferences was the 1941 Atlantic Conference that led to the issuance of the famous Atlantic Charter, which recommended the formation of a new intergovernmental organization. Much as Roosevelt died in April 1945 before the UNO was officially established, it was his initiative. Reference. Questions. 1. The only thing you need to fear is fear itself. Was this a fair promise to